is out praising him as a by-the-book prosecutor, Mr. Bragg. He's not. He's barely been a prosecutor for, a year and a half, I think. And he's fumbled everything, and now he's trying to rescue his political career by indicting Donald Trump. It will be very unfortunate if this actually unfolds. We'll keep you posted as details arrive. The biggest story in the world, though, the really biggest story in the world is in Beijing, where Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, is meeting with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Xi praised Putin's strong leadership and also called him the, quote, junior partner to China. From the Financial Times, Putin and Xi will place their growing economic ties at the heart of talks in the Kremlin today, highlighting Moscow's dependence on Beijing after its economy was largely severed from the West. I tweeted last night a picture of Mussolini and Hitler in Berlin in 1936. The Pact of Steel was not signed for 2 years later, but it was a 2.5, 3 year courtship of the axis of evil back in the 30s, and the same thing is unfolding in front of our eyes. Putin and Xi celebrate ties unbroken by Russia's war in Ukraine, is the New York Times headline. In segment 3 today, I'm going to read the highlights of the new essay by Dr. Jerry Hendricks in The Atlantic, which is titled The End of American Sea Power Dominance. And we're going to talk about how this has come to define our era. The age of American naval dominance is over. If you're following me on Twitter, I've gone and linked the story there. I urge you to go and read it. I'll read you some key excerpts in segment 3 of this first hour. Dr. Hendricks joining us right before Dan Crenshaw in hour 3 today. Also, Wall Street CEOs are trying to come up with a new plan to rescue the First Republic Bank. We'll see about that. Amazon announced it's cutting 9,000 workers. Recession is here, friends. Recession is here. That doesn't mean you're going to lose your job. It means a lot of people are going to get laid off at places that are big and want to get small when demand drops for a prolonged period of time. As I've already mentioned to you, the Trump grand jury is hearing from a likely final witness on a hush money payment. It was Robert Costello, a partner in the New York office of David Hutcher and Citron, who has previously waived his attorney-client privilege with Michael Cohen. Will be testifying about why Michael Cohen is not exactly the witness you want to hang your testimony on. But this Politico piece, by the book DA, confronts unpredictable opponent in Trump. Prosecutor in Trump, that's from Politico. It's just so crazily left-wing. Prosecutor in Trump case wades into treacherous political waters. They're not treacherous. They're disastrous for the United States. Headline in the Wall Street Journal, Federal Reserve faces tough decision on rate increase. Yes, it does. I talked with economist McKenzie, the author of this new book, Reality is Tricky, Contrarian Takes on Contested Economic Issues. And he just says they've got to do at least a quarter point. And then they've got to signal in their notes that they'll guarantee every deposit. They got to walk this fine line. They're like Johnny Cash. Joe Biden vetoed the effort to block ESG ruining your pensions. 2 Democrats voted for it in the Senate, one of whom is John Tester, one of whom is Joe Manchin, both of whom are running for re-election, and neither of which will get the benefit of voting for the anti-ESG sentiment in their state and in other red states because they also voted for Chuck Schumer to be leader. Now, if Tester and Manchin want to come over and be Republicans, that's just fine. But no one's going to believe that they did that other than for naked political reasons, and it won't work. Voters are smart. Iowa's sharp right turn from centrist state to the Florida of the North, it says disparagingly in the Annie Goen piece in the Washington Post. That's the headline. Iowa has gone red, just like Ohio before it, just like Missouri before it. Now, Colorado's gone deep blue, along with New Mexico deep blue, and Arizona and New Hampshire are the last purple states, as far as I'm concerned. Everything else, maybe you add Pennsylvania in, maybe you add Wisconsin, and Michigan isn't purple, Michigan is blue. But we've had surprises before, and there are 2 years for the Republican candidates to break the blue wall in Pennsylvania again and to shore up their red wall in Florida to Iowa down to Texas. It's really becoming an extraordinarily self-sorted country. Doesn't mean we're going to break up or have violence. It just means we are self-sorting. The UN yesterday announced to the complete indifference of the world that the world has less than a decade to stop catastrophic warming. The world does not care about catastrophic warming. Right now, we've got these two guys, these two dictators, the communist totalitarian Xi, the authoritarian dictator Putin, and they're plotting the world. Go read the Hendricks piece. Go read the Hendricks piece. I'll talk with him a little bit later today about that. I also want to play for you, though, the 60 Minutes. I'll play that in the next segment. The 60 Minutes bit from Sunday night where they talk about Chinese naval domination. I might play that next segment and then read you some excerpts of the Hendricks essay in segment 3. But I do want to ask you to remember Food for the Poor. We're getting close to our goal. And thank you. I've run back-to-back campaigns sponsored by Food for the Poor. We contribute to Food for the Poor because they get food places that they need to be, whether it's the Turkey earthquake, Ukraine. Right now they're focused on the famine in Central America and in Haiti, which is perennially on its back. Here is Honduran TV, cut number 5. Your own children, you just couldn't have your children in this condition.
People have stopped eating. They can only eat one meal a day. It's not healthy. Cases of child malnutrition in the country have increased along with hunger.
Hunger here first affects marginalized populations and more mothers like JC. She's struggling to feed her 4 children.
You could help feed every child there. If you go to the banner at the top of Hugh Hewitt, it says give life, give food. Or you can call 855-359-4673. 855-359-4673. Text my name, Hugh, H-U-G-H, to 91999. Or go to HughHewitt.com and wait for the banner to load. Hit on that and please be generous. I had lunch with Bud the contractor yesterday. He's still not finishing jobs that he began 25 years ago. But he's still fun for lunch. And I swear to you, a retired Anaheim Hills police officer who became a UCI, University of California, Irvine police officer, approached us briefly just to say hello and that he liked the show. But out of his mouth came the immortal words, which I've heard 1,000 times. Hello, Dennis. I'm a big fan. And, we got a good chuckle out of it when I said, well, I'm Hugh. And he said, oh, gosh, my wife's going to kill me. But, officer, I think, actually, it's commander, I think you need to be assured 1,000 people have done that to me. I'm not worried about that. We had a great chat with him afterwards. And Bud was even semi-coherent for part of the time. I want to play for you, in anticipation of in the next segment, reading you a large part of Jerry Hendricks' essay in The Atlantic, and he'll be along in the last hour, a bit that played on 60 Minutes. It's the perfect backdrop, as is the Hendricks article, which I've just pushed out on Twitter. If you're following me on Twitter, Hugh Hewitt. On Sunday night, 2 nights ago, Toshi Yoshihara was on talking, as were other guests, talking with 60 Minutes about the massive, stunning expansion of the Chinese blue water fleet. Give a listen to this, cut number 16.
There is a tendency among the great powers to look at each other's naval buildups with deep suspicion.
Toshi Yoshihara of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments may know more than any scholar in the West about China's Navy.
China will have about 440 ships by 2030, and that's according to the Pentagon.
Why is China able to build more warships more quickly than the U.S.?
China has clearly invested in this defense industrial infrastructure to produce these ships, which allows them to produce multiple ships simultaneously, essentially outbuilding many of the Western navies combined.
China's Navy piggybacks on a booming commercial shipbuilding industry kept afloat by generous state subsidies, inexpensive materials, and cheap labor. In the United States, it's a different story. After the Cold War ended, the shipbuilding industry consolidated, and many of the yards where ships were both built and maintained closed down.
What do you see when you see China's shipbuilding program?
It's very robust.
Do we have enough shipyards?
No. I wish that we had more commercial shipyards. Over my career, we've gone from more than 30 shipyards down to about 7 that we rely upon on a day-to-day basis to build ships.
One of those yards is run by Huntington Ingalls Industries, which built the state-of-the-art new Ford-class aircraft carrier. After controlled explosions in 2021 to prove it could withstand combat, the Ford got closer to deployment. 6 years late, and billions of dollars over budget. The Navy's not just struggling to build new ships on time. According to the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, there's a multi-year backlog repairing the ships in the fleet.
Our maintenance backlog is one of the primary things that I'm working on to correct. So just 3 years ago, we had 7,700 delay days. That is extra days in a shipyard by ships when they weren't operational. We have cut that down to 3,000. We are not satisfied.
Maintenance delays mean sailors can't come home because the ship that's supposed to replace them is not ready. It means longer deployments. It means away from your family more. That's a big strain.
Stop right there. That's not what it means. It means the United States is vulnerable. That's why I want you to read the Hendricks essay. That's why I'm going to have Dr. Hendricks on, Captain Hendricks, call him whatever you want. This is a major piece in the Atlantic. I hope every Republican gathered in Orlando reads it, that it's widely distributed down there, and that it is discussed. We need a SHIPS Act, as Dr. Hendricks points out, not just a CHIPS Act, if we're going to get back into the game and maintain freedom of the seas. I cannot emphasize to you enough how important this essay is and how I'm glad 60 Minutes looked, but they ought to have done more. That was CNO Gilday, Admiral Gilday, talking about the shipyard shortage on 60 Minutes. Welcome back, America. As I said, the most important thing, not just to the Hugh Hewitt Show audience, but to the world, is that the Communist Chinese Party head, Xi Jinping, the strongman, the totalitarian ruler of all of China, head of the Chinese Communist Party, has been in Moscow for 2 days, meeting what he calls his junior partner, Putin. It reminds you of Hitler and Mussolini, if you know your history, in 1939 getting together. That's why I asked Dr. Hendricks to come on today. Jerry Hendricks will be on in hour 3 to discuss his brand new essay in The Atlantic, which has really caught the attention of Washington, D.C., because The Atlantic is the last magazine that many people read in America in hardcover copy form. And the title of the article is "The Age of American Naval Dominance is Over." The subheading is "The United States has ceded the oceans to its enemies. We can no longer take freedom of the seas for granted." And this is sort of something I talked about a lot for the last, 10 years, when Donald Trump was running and promising a 355-ship Navy. That didn't come about. The biggest failure of the Trump years was the failure to get the shipyards expanded up and running, getting a Navy plan. And the key facts that I'll be talking about with Dr. Hendricks in hour 3 is that the United States had 6,700 ships at sea at the end of World War II. By the end of Eisenhower administration, we were down to 1,000, which is consistent with the Cold War. And then it fell and fell until Reagan arrived and rebuilt the Navy to 590 ships. That had the deterrent effect on the Soviet Union. It fell apart. And then in our wisdom, we thought the end of history had arrived, and we are now at 271 ships afloat. And Dr. Hendricks says the complications of that, the implications of that are so profound that people don't even see the obvious in front of them. So I wanted to read you a few graphs as preparation. I've tweeted out the link. If you follow me at HughHewitt.com, you can go find the link to the Atlantic article by Dr. Hendricks. It begins. Very few Americans, or for that matter, very few people on the planet, can remember a time when freedom of the seas was in question. But for most of human history, there was no such guarantee. Pirates, predatory states, the fleets of great powers did as they pleased. The current reality, which dates only the end of World War II, makes possible the commercial shipping that handles more than 80% of all global trade by volume. Oil and natural gas, grain and raw ores, manufactured goods of every kind. Because freedom of the seas in our lifetime has seemed like a default condition, it is easy to think of it, if we think of it at all, as akin to Earth's rotation or the force of gravity. It's just the way things are, rather than as a man-made construct that needs to be maintained and enforced. But what if safe transit ships could no longer be assumed? What if the oceans were no longer free? Dr. Hendricks goes on and points out, we got little glimpses of what happens when the screw-ups of the sea are even transitory. The Suez Canal blockage, the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles mess up. And then he goes on to say, what happens if if either of our enemies moves. All right, what happens if we lose freedom of the sea? The events were temporary. The Suez Canal and the Long Beach meltdown, if expensive. Imagine, though, Dr. Hendricks right, a more permanent breakdown. A humiliated Russia could declare a large portion of the Arctic Ocean to be its own territorial waters, twisting the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to support its claim. Russia would then allow its allies access to this route while denying it to those who dare oppose Putin's wishes. Neither the U.S. Navy, which has not built an Arctic-rated surface warship since the 1950s, nor any other nation in NATO currently is equipped to resist such a gambit. Or maybe the new adversarial alliance between Russia and Taiwan, maybe the first move would be Xi Jinping, shoring up his domestic standing by attempting to seize Taiwan and using China's anti-ship ballistic missiles and other weapons to keep Western navies at bay. An emboldened China might seek to cement its claim over large portions of the East China Sea and the entirety of the South China Sea as territorial waters. Once one nation, and this is the key thing, if one nation acts in this matter, others would follow, claiming in large territorial waters of their own, extracting what they could from the commerce that flows through them. The great container ships and tankers of today would disappear, replaced by smaller, faster cargo vessels capable of moving rare and valuable goods past pirates and corrupt officials. The cruise ship business, which drives many tourist economies, would falter in the face of hijacking. A single such incident would create a cascade of failure throughout the entire industry. Once busy sea lanes would lose their traffic. If oceanic trade declines, markets would turn inward, perhaps selling a sell-off to rival the Great Depression. Nations would be reduced to living on their own natural resources or those they could buy or take from their immediate neighbors. The world's oceans, for 70 years assumed to be a global commons, would become a no man's land. This is the state of affairs that, without a moment thought, we have invited. Everywhere I look, Hendricks concerns, I observe sea power manifesting itself, unacknowledged in American life. And then a very elegant section on how if you shop at Walmart, you're actually shopping at container ships that have brought their goods from around the world. The World War II, I want to be careful to be, destroyed or left destitute all of the world powers, and opposed to the concept of a mare liberum, a free sea. And this free sea concept, which we take for granted, has never been taken for granted, but we enforced it after World War II, we and our allies. And Russia had no ability to challenge it. But as I said, we went from 6,700 ships in 6,700 ships in the year immediately at the end of World War II, dropped to 1,000 by the end of Ike. 590 was rebuilt by Reagan after Jimmy Carter's disastrous shipbuilding pause. And now we're down to 271. And China is building. China, writes Hendricks, which for a time enjoyed double-digit GDP growth, expanded both its commercial and its naval ship capacities. It tripled the size of the People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLAN, and invested in long-range sensors and missiles that could allow it to interdict commercial and military ships more than 1,000 miles from its shore. And then there's a little bit of history of how we came to embrace sea power. And he said the American industrial base is the real culprit here. And there's so much stunning here, and I follow this. We had, at the end of World War II, 50 graving docks, right? Heavy industrial locations where ships are assembled. They were greater than 150 meters in length. So you need to have graving docks. 150 of them in 1946. We have 23 today, and only a dozen of them are certified to work on Navy ships. We need a SHIPS Act to complement the CHIPS Act, because the Navy right now, concludes Hendrick, is not a wartime force. The new Navy must not look like the old Navy. We need to invest in submarines that cannot be found. We have to invest in ships that can survive and submersibles. We have to make sure so much gets done. And we need smaller shipyards along the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers, along the Gulf Coast, in the Great Lakes as they were in World War II. And the Hendricks essay is a must read. Now, with that background, I want you to listen again to the 60 Minutes piece, cut number 14 from Sunday night. And the second voice you hear is the chief of naval operations after the third voice you hear, after the CSIS scholar is interviewed. Go ahead, Jacob.
There is a tendency among the great powers to look at each other's naval buildups with deep suspicion.
Toshi Yoshihara of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments may know more than any scholar in the West about China's Navy.
China will have about 440 ships by 2030, and that's according to the Pentagon.
Why is China able to build more warships more quickly than the U.S.?
China has clearly invested in this defense industrial infrastructure to produce these ships, which allows them to produce multiple ships simultaneously, essentially outbuilding many of the Western navies combined.
China's Navy piggybacks on a booming commercial shipbuilding industry kept afloat by generous state subsidies, inexpensive materials, and cheap labor. In the United States, it's a different story. After the Cold War ended, the shipbuilding industry consolidated, and many of the yards where ships were both built and maintained closed down.
What do you see when you see China's shipbuilding program?
It's very robust.
Do we have enough shipyards?
No. I wish that we had more commercial shipyards. Over my career, we've gone from more than 30 shipyards down to about 7 that we rely upon on a day-to-day basis to build ships.
One of those yards...
Down to 7. Which happened in World War II because we had 6,900 ships at the fleet at full tide. We're down to 271. Dr. Jerry Hendricks, Captain Jerry Hendricks, has issued a new essay in The Atlantic, which is the perfect place for the age of American naval dominance is over. That's the title of the essay, because that's where the first call to arms about the oceans appeared many, many decades ago. Dr. Hendricks, welcome. I've been talking about you all morning. Your ears have been burning. Gallagher was talking about you. How has the Atlantic essay been received?
Well, it's been actually, I've been gratified at the reception of it. I got a lot of feedback from friends within the naval community, a lot of retired admirals, a lot of people in the business community, a lot of, just navalists writ large have reached out to me to talk about the essay, to provide feedback on areas that they thought I could have gone a little bit more deeply, but express appreciation for essentially raising the topic in a magazine like The Atlantic, magazine where Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great American strategist, first published in 1890, the magazine where Theodore Roosevelt published as a young man on his way to become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So it's the perfect platform to have a conversation about this. And especially getting to an audience that perhaps has not had a conversation about the sea and maritime strategy in quite some time.
Now, the fortunate part, good news, bad news, is that Xi and Putin are meeting in Moscow this week. And 7 days ago, you published an essay that said either of those powers could shut down freedom of the seas in a moment, bring us into conflict, at which point the Navy's going to have to make some decisions. And you paint real world threats. Earlier today, Congressman Gallagher said they played a Chinese attack on Taiwan war game for 90 minutes at the GOP Congressional Caucus with your friend Admiral Montgomery providing commentary. Are you encouraged by, A, that The Atlantic wanted your article, B, 60 Minutes ran a story on sea power, and C, that the Republican caucuses are running war games?
I'm encouraged by all three of those items that you just mentioned. Obviously, as we look at Xi and Putin coming together, these are two great traditional continental powers. They're land powers that share a long border between each other. Both of those nations have always viewed the sea suspiciously because the sea is a medium for the free exchange of commerce. And the concept of freedom and the exchange of free ideas is something that they look very nervously on, which is one of the reasons why both of them have sought to control the seas and the oceans around them. Russia's been very focused on the Baltic and the Black Sea and now the Arctic over the last 50 years. China has now looked at the East China Sea and the South China Sea and essentially has laid these territorial claims as if they are internal waters. And of course, this is a threat to the very concept of the free sea, which is sort of foundational to the Western Enlightenment and to the way that the globalized system that the United States has spent 70 years building. So seeing them together makes me very nervous because they have a lot of potential power. They can do a lot of damage to the international economic system if they act together.
You know, now you anticipate the criticism in your essay in The Atlantic, by that, people are going to say, well, we don't have a lot of buggies and horsewhips around anymore either. So going from 6,900 ships to 271 doesn't matter. But Jerry, it does matter. And would you explain to people why we are now below the critical line? I think we've kind of flatlined.
Yeah. So, Hugh, I'm going to make a slight adjustment in your numbers. So we had 6,700 at the end of World War II. You're correct. We came down to about 1,000 ships during the Eisenhower administration, and we remained steady state through about 1969. And then Vietnam sort of began to eat into the naval budget at that point in time. So we dropped down during the Ford and Carter administrations. Reagan rebuilds us to nearly 600. And then essentially after the Cold War, we declared those peace dividends and we just started cashing in. So we cut 100 ships in the first year after the end of the Cold War, and we bottomed out at 271 during the Obama administration. There were some slight incremental changes. I checked this morning. The fleet's at 296. But the point that I make here is that when you dropped below 300, that was a go signal to China. You can look at their investments. You can look at the time when they changed their strategy. That occurred in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when the U.S. Navy dropped below 300, and China and Russia, to a certain extent, made the decision that, okay, the Americans aren't paying attention to the great oceans, the global commons. Now is our time to make our move. So they began to invest. And as the 60 Minutes report made the point, the Chinese Navy has tripled essentially in the last 15 years, tripled in size, and is tremendously more modern.
Now, Captain Hendricks, you also point out our capacity to build and repair has plummeted. I didn't know the word gravette. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Gravette? Is it gravette? I don't know what it is, but I know we haven't got them.
I think you're talking about graving docks there.
Yes.
And essentially those graving docks, those are the golden goose. Those are the things that lay the eggs, and the eggs are these ships. And if you don't have graving docks, then you don't have ships. And
explain what they are.
Cut back on. Yeah, so a graving dock is simply a place where a ship is assembled. So it's a large industrial construction site, and obviously it has to have access to the water, because when the ship is finally ready to be launched, it's going to have to slide out in the water. But these things have to be very large. They're very, they've got huge foundations. They can bear great amounts of weight. Obviously, the Ford-class aircraft carrier weighs in at 100,000 tons. So you have to have something that can hold that. You build it within it, and then you flood it, and you float the ships out at the end. During World War II, we had over 50 of these that could service ships or build ships of a length of 150 meters or greater. Today, we're down to around 20, 23, with only 12 of them being certified for the Navy's use. So it's a tremendous cutback in the industrial capacity of the United States, not just to build ships, Hugh, but to repair them. And this is a point I made in the essay as well. We no longer have the capacity to repair the ships that we have. Almost a third of our submarine force is sidelined right now, waiting access to these graving docks, these repair yards, where they can be brought in and serviced. And when you got a third of your fleet on the sidelines, you're not ready for battle. And the enemy is watching.
So, Jerry Hendricks, you advocate for a SHIPS Act to accompany the CHIPS Act. Congressman Gallagher echoed that call for a SHIPS Act. What would be in it? Because a lot of Republicans are skeptical of spending money right now, given our $31 trillion debt. What would be in a SHIPS Act?
Well, I think we'd have to make a major investment in the industrial base, and we have to make a wise investment. We have to go back almost to the Eisenhower dispersal policy type of investment, where we began to make decisions about where we need to have additional capacity so that we could be safe in a time of war. You want to think about where you're going to be vulnerable in that time of war. So I raise in the essay that during World War II, we built a lot of ships on the Mississippi River, on the Ohio River. We even built submarines on Lake Michigan and then floated them out through the Chicago River to the Mississippi and down. We need to think about building where the workers are. That's one of the major challenges that we have today, is where is your blue-collar workforce located? And then you sort of have to try to figure out a plan to go to them. We are building on the East Coast. We have some construction capacity in San Diego. We have a yard up in Bremerton, Washington, that's been sidelined because of EPA regulations. So there's 4 dry docks up there that we can't even access right now. We need to kind of go and build where we can right now. And that's why I think we have the SHIPS Act, where we have an industrial policy to make targeted investments in smaller yards in order to increase their capacity to get us ready for war.
Jerry, assume for a moment that hypersonics is all the threat that it is, plus more. And the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy wanted to make a Pearl Harbor-like strike that was non-nuclear. They could hit our carriers, but how many different shipyards would they have to hit with hypersonics to put us, basically paralyze our ability to stay at sea?
Well, you heard the CNO say during the 60 Minutes interview that essentially we're dependent upon 7 shipyards. I know where they're at, and so do the Chinese. And so the idea that they would be able to target them. Now, the most difficult shipyards to reach are the ones that are farthest from Chinese access. So obviously you think about Guam, you think about Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor, a traditional area of where we've been attacked before. Those are very vulnerable. Then you come down to San Diego. Those are a little less vulnerable. Then you think about the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic. Those are less vulnerable because the Chinese have to work harder to get there. The Russians, by the way, we just operated a nuclear submarine in the Atlantic off the East Coast not too long ago, so they have that ability to reach there. I like the idea of, where we're building the frigate, which is up in Marinette, Wisconsin, in Congressman Gallagher's district. That's a place. And also looking at the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers, where we could build. That's deep inland, and that's sort of the types of investment that we made during the Cold War when we wanted to build missiles away from the coast. That's why we built the Titan missile in Colorado, Denver, Colorado, for instance, was to get away from that vulnerability to coastal attack.
So, Captain Hendricks, I want everyone to go and read this, but I want to close by hearing your thoughts on what Xi and Putin would be talking about if they were meeting like Mussolini and Hitler in 1936 and then again in 1938. What do you think they're talking about in terms of preemptive moves against the United States?
They're talking about, one, how are they going to set up a more robust, transportation system to be able to move men and material and supplies, mostly supplies, from China to Putin right now, because he's having real difficulties with troop generation and some of his ordnance. He's starting to run out of things like 155 rounds. So can the Chinese provide him that? Also, China's looking at Putin and saying, I need more energy for my economy. I can't depend on the energy that's coming out of the Middle East. Can you give me more out of your northern energy supplies? And so Putin's starting to talk about supply lines going through the Arctic Ocean and then down around Asia and then into Chinese ports. So I think that they're having that idea of sort of building this system of military exchange, technological exchange, and energy and commercial exchange. They're sort of knitting together this alliance, which, by the way, I think is something that we've seen coming for a while. They're going to have to come together before they grow apart, and they will grow apart eventually because the Russians hate to be thought as a subservient power to China, and that's very much what they are. They are the junior partner, as Xi said.
Xi said that. Last question on the 7th page of your article. China, for a time, enjoyed double-digit GDP growth. That allowed them to fund the PLA Navy long-range sensors and to interdict commercial and military ships more than 1,000 miles away. This happened right under our nose, Jerry. What did we think they were doing?
Well, this was a mistake that we made in many ways. When we pulled back from sort of supporting our own shipbuilding economy, essentially that allowed others to step in. So Asian shipbuilders in Japan, South Korea, and China. China is the largest shipbuilder in the world. They are producing more ships than the other great shipbuilding countries together, combined.
Wow.
In fact, one Chinese shipyard, and there's 19 of them, one Chinese shipyard has more capacity than all American shipyards combined.
Let's leave on that note. The article is "The Age of American Naval Dominance is Over." It's in the Atlantic right now, hard copy and available online. I urge you to go and read it. Send it to your friends. Captain Hendricks, as always, thank you for joining me. I should also say Dr. Hendricks. A PhD comes in handy when you write for the Atlantic. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks. Stay tuned, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt.